Welcome to this workshop. This is the truth about sugar and alcohol. This is all about knowledge as power. And of course, most people know that alcohol affects the body and the brain, but not a lot of people are aware of just how profound the impact sugar can have. And the reality is that both substances are processed in surprisingly similar ways once they are in our bodies. And of course, that can lead to long term health consequences. So, in this workshop, we're going to discuss the hidden impacts of alcohol and sugar, how they influence our metabolism, our brain function, and our overall well being. And more importantly, we're going to explore practical strategies to be able to help you make more informed decisions and choices without feeling deprived. So, let's get started. I am Dr. Heather Bear, and I am a licensed nutritionist. I'm a board certified nutrition specialist, an integrative wellness coach, and a mind body medicine practitioner. And in today's event, we're going to cover quite a few things. We're going to talk about what happens when we consume sugar and alcohol, and how that impacts our body in very similar ways. We'll go into three ways that alcohol and sugar can harm our health, from liver damage to addiction, all of these hidden risks that you need to be aware of to be able to make informed choices. We're then going to go through some of the things that we, are common, or what we believe to be as common knowledge, the idea of red wine or sugar being good for you. We're going to separate some of that fact from fiction and just make sure that you're aware of where some of these health claims are coming from. We'll then talk about, who benefits from sugar and alcohol. When is it something that we can do? What does balance look like? And then we'll go into some practical tips to move forward. All right, so let's get right down to it. What happens when we drink alcohol? Well, we often think that the effects of alcohol are going to be summed by how we feel, right? We drink alcohol, we wait to see how we feel. But what's happening inside of our body actually is a lot bigger than just how we're feeling. And in fact, from the moment that we take a sip of alcohol, the alcohol actually starts moving through our system, which starts to affect our brain and our metabolism even faster than we may be aware of. And so the idea here is that alcohol hits your brain in just 5 minutes. And so for a lot of this, I'm going to be talking specifically about the brain. But unlike food, which takes a little bit more time to digest and then, of course, be absorbed, alcohol goes right to it. It's absorbed quickly into your bloodstream. And so in just 5 minutes, alcohol is able to reach your brain. Within 10, it's already able to affect your cognitive function. These are going to be things like your decision making, your motor skills. We also know that our liver can only process 1 ounce of alcohol per hour. And so after about 20 minutes, our liver kicks in and starts breaking down the alcohol. But the issue here is that our liver, it's only able to process about 1 ounce per hour, which is a standard, like the actual measured standard drink. And so what happens is if we start to drink faster than our liver can keep up, the excess alcohol stays in our bloodstream. And that's where that intoxication starts to happen. And so intoxication is measured in different levels throughout our country, throughout different countries. Right now, I'm using what we see in Florida, but the legal BCA is 0.08, and that takes 5 hours to leave your system. And most people know, right, that the blood alcohol level, or the BAC, is 0.8, and that's the legal limit for driving. But many of us don't realize how long it takes for it to actually clear the system. And so that means that even if you're feeling sober in the morning, right, after a night out, and it, probably not applicable to everyone listening here, but certainly, college kids, I know I've been there myself. You get home at 5 a.m. and then you head out the door at 10 for a class or something like that. And your body may not have actually had enough time to process all of that alcohol that's still there. So alcohol does stay longer than we may think. And interestingly, even when we aren't intoxicated anymore, alcohol actually remains detectable in different parts of our bodies for even longer. So for example, in our urine, it can take up to 80 hours or 3 days to process and eliminate all of the toxic effects of the alcohol. In our hair follicles, it can last up to 3 months. And so this is why alcohol tests for employment or for legal cases can still detect drinking even after the effects have worn off. And of course, if we look at the science of intoxication as to why it is that people get that intoxicated feeling, well, it happens when we drink faster than our body can metabolize alcohol. Your brain function literally slows down, and the reflexes are decreased and your judgment starts to get impaired. And so this is why, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but binge drinking is especially dangerous. Literally, it's just our liver not being able to keep up. So when we start to feel the effects of alcohol, when we start to feel drunk, when we start to feel tipsy, that's literally just it's a sign that we have too much in our body. Our liver is not able to keep up with the processing of it. Okay, so the effects of alcohol are immediate. And of course, it only takes one drink for your body to start feeling the effects of alcohol, even if you don't realize it. And like I've mentioned, the moment that alcohol enters the system, it's already starting to affect your brain, your liver, and your metabolism. Your liver is going to immediately start working to break everything down. But again, that number, it's only one standard drink per hour. And so this is why we start to have experience the effects, even if we're not mentally aware of it, right? Just because we don't notice the effects doesn't mean that our body isn't working hard to process it. And so let's talk about how it affects the brain. And this is important just because a lot of things happen here, and a lot of people aren't familiar with all of the effects of the impact that alcohol can have on our brain. Well, the first is it immediately alters our brain chemistry. Two neurotransmitters specifically come into play. We've got GABA. This is your body's or your brain's natural calm down chemical. Alcohol is going to increase GABA activity, making you feel more relaxed, less anxious, maybe even a little bit more social. It's also going to boost dopamine, which is the brain's feel good neurotransmitter, which is why drinking can feel enjoyable or, euphoric in the moment. But the issue here is that your body always wants to seek balance, that homeostasis. And so as alcohol starts to wear off, your brain tries to correct that imbalance. And so what it does is it releases glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter that does the opposite of GABA. Glutamate increases anxiety, restlessness, and overthinking. And so you have that anxiety, right? That dreaded anxiety that can happen later on. And so this is why the day after drinking, you might feel more on edge, you may feel more irritable or emotionally drained. It's not just the dehydration. It is dehydration too, but it's also your brain overcompensating for the chemical shifts that happened after a night of drinking. And so the roller coaster effect is, one reason that alcohol can be really tricky, because it gives you this short-term dopamine boost, but then it leaves you feeling worse the next day. And so what else does it do? Well, it's not just about relaxing. It actually suppresses the activity and the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for processing our emotions, things like fear, anxiety, even social cues. And so at first, this can feel like a good thing. With a few drinks, you may feel more confident, more carefree, less inhibited. But that's because the amygdala is dampened. It's literally less sensitive to be able to notice and pick up on stress and social anxiety. So it's just dulled. The senses are dulled. And so it gets really tricky because your ability to detect emotional cues is also diminishing. And so this is where you start to have, a misunderstanding. You may misinterpret someone's tone, their body language, or their intentions. You may miss subtle facial expressions that would normally, caution you to need more empathy. But this is why we say that alcohol impairs judgment in social interactions. You might overstep boundaries or misread situations or miss, cues altogether. Basically acting different than you would if you were sober. And so ultimately, we think of alcohol as this, it like boosts our ability to be more social and engage easier in conversations. But at the same time, it's making us socially inept, right? It's keeping our ability to be able to read the room at a level that we'd want to, in order to be able to be engaging socially and interacting in a way that we want. All right, so what else does it do? Well, if we talk about the cerebral cortex, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for thought processing and decision making and conscious awareness, well, it helps us make sense of the world by processing all of these things. So the cerebral cortex is kind of like the region of the brain that takes everything that's kind of swirling around and then interprets it. And so that's where we're able to interpret, the information from our senses, from our emotions, from the experiences that we're engaged in. But of course, when we drink alcohol, this whole process slows down. And so that's where you have the idea of, behavior inhibitions are lowered. Alcohol is going to depress the behavioral inhibitory centers, which means that you might do things that you wouldn't normally do. This is why people often feel more impulsive or take risks after drinking. The tattoos. Let's all go get a tattoo. It's like a wonderful idea. But that's because our senses can become blunted, right? We don't have as much common sense. That area within our brain, within our cerebral cortex, that basically takes and shuffles this around to tell you if it's a good idea or a bad idea, is not working as well. But of course, we also are slowing things down physically, right? The information that we're getting from our eyes, from our ears, from our mouth, from all of our senses, it makes it harder for us to be able to process these as well. So it's harder for us to say what we need to say, to understand what we need to understand. And this is where we can then have, judgment and decision making start to become impaired. All of this stemming from the cerebral cortex not working at its capacity. Ultimately, rational thinking takes a back seat, and sometimes we don't even realize it. It all just kind of depends on how intoxicated we are. So, last one here, another little bit here to go into the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is responsible for movement and balance. I always think of, when I used to teach this in anatomy and physiology, I'd say cerebellum is a little ballerina, because it was affecting movement and coordination and balance. And so it would help the students remember. But this part of your brain helps you coordinate, again, movement and balance. And so alcohol slows down this cerebellum activity, which is why it's easier to stumble, feel dizzy after drinking. Even if you feel fine, your coordination is inevitably impaired even after just a couple drinks. We also have the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And this is the hormones. So these are going to regulate hormones, memory, our libido. The hypothalamus specifically regulates hormones, body temperature, emotions too. Pituitary gland is going to specifically control the hormone release. And alcohol, of course, it increases sexual desire, but it reduces performance by interfering with the hormone regulation and blood flow. So it also impairs memory formation, which is why some people, experience blackouts after nights of heavy drinking or days of heavy drinking. We also have the medulla, which is what's going to be controlled with breathing, consciousness, body temperature. This is where you have extreme cases where people just drink so much that they actually die. And that's because you could suppress that so much that your breathing actually stops. But the medulla, it controls not just breathing, but also our basic survival functions, body temperature regulation, things like that. And alcohol suppresses that activity, which is why we start to feel sleepy and drowsy. But of course, the sleep that we get after a night of drinking is poor. A lot of times it's fragmented. And that's because we're not able to get that deep rest, that deep state of rest. Our body just can't let us get into that space. So even if you have a night of drinking or a full night of sleep after a night of drinking, chances are you're waking up, not very rested the next morning. Of course, in extreme cases, alcohol poisoning, like I mentioned, it can slow breathing so much and lower body so much to the point that it gets to a really dangerous level. And one fun thing, do I have it here? Yeah. One of the things that my students always wanted to know, so why does it make me, why does drinking make me pee so much? Well, of course, that's part of the dehydration. That's part of how alcohol dehydrates us. But the hypothalamus regulates a hormone called vasopressin, which is that ADH hormone, or the antidiuretic hormone, which tells our kidneys to hold on to water when it's needed. Alcohol suppresses vasopressin, which causes our kidneys to release more fluid than usual. So this is why you pee more often when you drink, which of course leads to dehydration. And dehydration is what plays a major role in the hangover. It contributes to headaches and fatigue and dizziness, all of that, unpleasant experience the next day. So the idea here is that alcohol doesn't just make you tipsy, it literally disrupts your entire system, everything from balance to memory, hormones, hydration. And of course, the more you drink, the more these effects are compounded. And so let's talk about some of the, the the notions that we have with alcohol being something that's actually healthy for us. And this is what I get all the time. Well, I thought red wine is healthy for me. I thought it's an antioxidant, right? We've got the resveratrol. Well, you may have heard that it has health benefits, particularly for the heart. And there is some truth to that. If you start to scour through the research and you start to see, some of the antioxidants, again, the resveratrol that's in the skin of the grapes, which is why red wine is what has the resveratrol, not the pink or the white wine, because it needs the grape skin to be able to get it. But red wine's made through fermentation, this process that naturally increases the antioxidant capacity. And that's where you see the polyphenols, which are powerful antioxidants. These are found in all sorts of colorful fruits and vegetables. One of the most well-known, of course, being that resveratrol that I've mentioned. And resveratrol has been linked to all kinds of amazing heart health benefits. But if we start to think about, the factor hype, well, again, some research suggests that moderate wine consumption is linked to lower rates of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, even some cancers. But these benefits, it's important to understand that they're not exclusive to wine, and you can get the same, possibly even better benefits from eating a diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, all of the things that we've been learning about. It's that bright, vibrant color that you're going to get a lot of these polyphenols from. The interesting thing, though, is, in moderation. So it's very easy to overdo it. Again, 1 ounce or 1 serving of red wine is that 5-ounce pour, which is a relatively small size. So it's easy to overdo it. And of course, the catch, well, alcohol is still going to come with risks. All of us are going to have unique risks, based on our genetic predisposition, our stress, where we live as far as pollution and things like that. So red wine does contain antioxidants, but the alcohol in it is still a toxin. And of course, used frequently, repeatedly, that's going to stress the liver, and that can increase the risk of cancer and disrupt the metabolism. So the idea here is that the health benefits that come from the polyphenols, well, you can still get those from the polyphenols and not necessarily the alcohol. So when you try to incorporate foods like berries, dark chocolate, green tea, you can do that and still incorporate those into your diet without the added risk of drinking. All right. So, and if we look at what the World Health Organization says, and then, we can take this, for what it is. They have identified alcohol as, not being completely risk-free. So what do they say? Well, according to the WHO, they say that there is no safe amount of alcohol that does not impact your health. Even, excuse me, even light drinking contributes to cell damage, inflammation, and increased risk of disease. In fact, studies show that alcohol's carcinogenic effects don't have a threshold, meaning there's no point to where the risk suddenly just switches on. Ultimately, the damage accumulates over time, even at low levels. We also know that alcohol is a group 1 or a class 1 carcinogen. And this comes from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or the IARC, again, classifying alcohol as a class 1 or a group 1 carcinogen, which is the highest risk category. This is in the same group as asbestos, tobacco, radiation, which means in order for them to have classified that there's a strong, undeniable evidence that alcohol increases your risk of cancer. And that's going to be including, breast cancer, liver cancer, throat, colon, and a few other cancers, just to name a few. And so while we often hear about moderate drinking being okay, the reality is that, at any level, drinking is going to have a measurable effect on the health. The question isn't whether it's harmful, but rather whether the benefits outweigh the risks for you specifically. And so let's talk about the role of cancer specifically. Well, this is a personal reality for myself. When we talk about the risks of cancer, alcohol is one of the most overlooked but well-documented dangers. And it's really interesting to kind of see how all of this plays out. The idea here is that the more you drink, the higher your risk. And this comes right from the National Cancer Institute. The research shows a clear dose-dependent relationship, meaning the more alcohol you drink, especially over time, the higher your risk of developing an alcohol-associated cancer. And so we now see strong patterns between alcohol consumption and cancers of the head, the neck, the esophagus, liver, breast, colon, some of the biggest killers here. And, specifically with breast cancer, well, this hits really close to home for me. In fact, my sister-in-law, or my ex-sister-in-law, she was a really heavy drinker. And unfortunately, she also had a family history of breast cancer. And so at 27 years old, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was something that was shocking to the entire family. But the reality is that when you look at the research, it's really not surprising. Studies show that when women drink just one drink per day, so when you habitually drink one drink a day, you have a 5 to 9% higher chance of developing breast cancer compared to people who don't drink at all. Now, if you're having multiple drinks a day and and you're chronically drinking, binge drinking on the weekends, that's going to expand significantly. And so when you combine alcohol then with a genetic predisposition, you're just adding fuel to the fire. And so the idea here is that this isn't about fear. This is about awareness, because awareness is going to bring the power, and knowing that risk gives you the power to make informed decisions. And so the question isn't whether alcohol is harmful, but how much risk, can you take? Can you afford to take? All right. So the idea here is that, it all matters. And so this in particular is very important. The patterns matter. 7 drinks on Saturday night does not equal a drink a day. That's really important because, when we look at averages, that particular average is where it doesn't work. And it's easy to think, well, I don't drink all week. And then I go out and I don't really have to pay attention because I know that I'm not drinking the rest of the week. It's just on the weekends. Well, research shows that your drinking patterns matter just as much as how much you consume, the total amount that you consume. Binge drinking is going to overload your body. And so binge drinking is when you drink, several drinks, 7 drinks in one night, right? If you were to do that, your liver, your brain, your metabolism, they all take a huge hit all at once. And so your liver can only process, again, 1 standard drink per hour. And the rest is going to sit in your system, circulating in your blood. And that's going to cause toxicity and inflammation. And so this is going to lead to higher levels of oxidative stress, higher levels of dehydration, damage to your vital organs. And this happens concentrated, right? Instead of spreading it out slowly over time, a smaller dose, right? And so what you have then is you have this increased risk of long-term damage. We know that binge drinking raises your risk for addiction. It also raises your risk for liver disease, cognitive decline, more than just moderate spaced out drinking. And that's just within the research. And so even if you don't drink daily, but you consume large amounts in one sitting, even if it's just once a week, once a month, that's going to significantly increase your chances of developing an alcohol-related disease, including high blood pressure, heart disease, cancer, things like that. And so, of course, we also have that immediate bender hangover effect, right? The binge drinking can lead to severe hydration, electrolyte imbalances, disrupted neurotransmitters, which is why you feel particularly crappy the next day. Your body is literally playing catch up for hours, sometimes even a whole day, which leaves you in that process with a weakened immune system, with poor anxiety, poor sleep. You've got that anxiety, brain fog. And so your body is literally recovering from that one session. So, moral of the story here is that, while alcohol is not necessarily truly safe, studies suggest that regular, moderate consumption, so 1 drink per day for women, up to 2 per men, up to 2 drinks a day for men, this is going to be less harmful than occasional binge drinking. So just to make that clear, it doesn't mean that daily drinking is recommended if you're not already drinking, right? It just highlights that binge drinking is particularly damaging. All right. So maybe you're like, all right, well, I'm in the clear because I don't really drink anything. I really don't drink very much alcohol. I stick to my mocktails and I'm good, or my soda or whatever it is. And so the other side here is the sugar. So there's a hidden connection between alcohol and sugar. And, we've spent a lot of time talking about alcohol and how it affects your brain, your liver, and your long-term health. And most of us are, it's pretty easy to say, yeah, okay, I agree with that. I understand. We know that excessive alcohol consumption is risky. But what if I told you that sugar behaves in almost an identical way in the body? And so the idea here is that alcohol and sugar, they're processed the same way. Just like alcohol, sugar, especially fructose, it's metabolized by the liver. And so when we consume too much sugar, the liver converts this to excess fat, which leads to fatty liver disease. And fatty liver disease is what happens to the liver when we drink too much alcohol as well. And of course, fatty liver disease can also, increase our risk for insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, and so many more things. And so this is why we see this, it's literally the same damage that we see in heavy drinkers. But this is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. And so what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that today children are developing NAFLD, even though they've never had a drink. And it's because it's coming from what? The sugar. It's coming from the sugar. And if you're a follower of some of the research, Dr. Robert Lustig, he's a leading researcher in this field, and you can find, he's got YouTubes, and Dr. Mark Hyman talks with him a lot in his podcast, but he's a leading researcher in this field of sugar and kind of just, helping people be really aware of the damages of sugar. And he describes it as a chronic toxin. So alcohol is an acute toxin, which means that you can feel its effects immediately, even, overdose. Obviously, with alcohol, you can have too much and actually overdose. Sugar works differently. It sneaks up on you. It can cause weight gain. It can cause inflammatory problems. It can cause metabolic syndrome. But the idea here is that it slowly sneaks up on you, and the damage happens over time, a lot of times before you even realize what's happening. We also know that it's addictive. Alcohol triggers dopamine release, which reinforces drinking behavior. Sugar does the same thing. This is why sugar cravings can feel just as intense as alcohol cravings. And so why cutting back, right, can actually trigger withdrawal-like symptoms in some people. And so the idea here is that if you're someone who's not drinking too much alcohol, but you consume a lot of sugar, it's worth asking, am I simply trading one substance for the other? All right, so let's talk about the sugar alcohol parallel and how it can actually harm the body. And so when we consume large amounts of sugar, particularly fructose, like I've mentioned, the liver and the pancreas, they're taking most of the work. They're actually working, overtime. This is an overload, similar to when you drink too much alcohol and that's going right to the liver, and it can only process one serving at a time, one serving per hour. Well, we've got a limit too with how much sugar that we can process. The pancreas has to pump out more insulin, right, to be able to open the doors of our cells, to be able to absorb that sugar that's coming into our body. And this is where the body can start resisting the insulin effects. If there's just too much, it starts to kind of build up a tolerance. This is how insulin resistance can develop. And that's the first step towards type 2 diabetes and other metabolic diseases. The thing that gets interesting, though, is that sugar, like I've mentioned, it's processed in the liver just like alcohol. And so, again, when the liver gets overwhelmed with too much sugar or too much alcohol, it starts to convert this to fat. And so that's where you get that fatty liver. And so just like alcoholics, this can build up. Remember, NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is a condition that was once only seen in heavy drinkers. And now we're seeing that it could actually happen to children. And so this is where you start to get that sugar belly. So we think of, when people have a really big belly, we think of, it's a beer belly, right? Well, no, it can also be a sugar belly, or, a metabolic body. And that can happen basically when we have fat spilling into the bloodstream because the liver can't keep up. So this is going to raise cholesterol. It's going to raise our triglycerides. It's going to raise our blood pressure. And of course, inevitably leading to that kind of swollen, distended belly, that excess fat around the midsection. And of course, this is one of the biggest predictors of heart disease and metabolic disorder. So it's actually one of the 5 key indicators of metabolic syndrome, is that distended belly. And so, the issue here, the scarier part, is that metabolic damage from sugar, again, mirrors that of alcohol. But yet many of us are not aware of this, especially children, right, who are eating bags of candy and drinking soda and essentially consuming sugar all day long. We understand that alcohol contributes to liver disease, heart disease, obesity. It makes sense, right? But the important thing to understand is that sugar does too. almost mimicking the pathway that alcohol does. And so, because we don't necessarily feel that immediate buzz, right? We don't realize how much we're consuming or how much impact it could be having. And so, what's important here is to understand that we don't need to demonize sugar. We just need to understand how it affects our body long term. So, again, we can make better choices with what we consume. All right. So, sugar addiction. So, sugar can be addictive. Sugar activates, again, the same reward pathways in the brain, like alcohol, like nicotine, or even hard drugs like cocaine. When you eat sugar, your brain releases dopamine, that feel good chemical that makes you want to repeat the behavior. This is why sugar feels comforting and satisfying, and why we often will turn to it when we're stressed or when we're tired or when we're emotional. But what's interesting is that we actually start to build a tolerance. The more we eat, the more we crave. The more we eat, the more we need to be able to continue to experience that. So, just like alcohol, our body's going to adapt over time. What used to be satisfying, like one cookie or one piece of chocolate, no longer gives us that same dopamine hit because now we've built tolerance. And so, you have to eat more to chase that feeling. And so, the same way that our brain builds tolerance to alcohol and drugs, it does that with sugar too. And so what happens is it might, what might be important to understand is that sugar activates the same reward pathways, right? So when our brain releases that dopamine when we're eating sugar, we're feeding that cycle. We're feeding that cycle of reward, right? Behavior and reward, behavior and reward. And so that's where the addiction, that's where you have the power to be able to understand, right? And be able to kind of put a cog in that wheel. All right. So how do we start to break free on that note? Well, again, you want to identify that feeling, right? Make sure that you're aware, you're very aware of the loop, right? I have that, we've got a behavior, we do this, we reward the behavior. And so you want to try to put a cog in that cycle. But it can be really hard to figure out where you're getting all of the sugar from, right? Because it's not just in sweets, it's literally hidden everywhere, even in foods that's marked as healthy. And so some of the common culprits are things like salad dressing, yogurts, granola bars, protein bars, our flavored coffee. Even natural juices can have a lot of sugar in it. So the important thing is to start reading the labels, looking at all of the ingredients in it, looking at things that end in ose, fructose, sucrose, dextrose, maltose. This is all going to be sugar in disguise. You also want to reduce processed foods. Same way that you would approach cutting back on alcohol. Instead of going cold turkey, you typically would start by reducing the frequency or swapping, making some healthier options or diluting it, right? The same strategy works for sugar. You want to swap out some of the processed whole foods for more unprocessed options. And of course, cooking at home is one of the easiest ways to control your sugar intake. The more real food that you eat, the less sugar you're going to consume without even trying. And of course, we want to make sure that we're balancing blood sugar. Lots of information in this week's articles about that, but sugary meals are going to lead to more cravings all day long. That's because your blood sugar is literally spiking. You've got this spike in glucose, and then it crashes, which makes you hungry again. And so the key is to balancing the cycle. That means eating meals that are going to include fiber, right? Lots of fiber, protein, healthy fats, things to be able to stabilize your blood sugar. So, for example, if you're starting your day with eggs and avocado, and maybe your sweetened coffee, instead of the sweetened coffee plus, granola plus a flavored yogurt and a flavored cereal, right? That's going to be a lot more sugar. This is going to be huge. This is going to make a big difference in how you feel and the cravings that you have later on. The other thing that's important is, you probably need to reset your taste buds. And if this is so true for so many of my clients that try to cut down on their sugar, right? When you start to cut down, even for a couple of weeks, your cravings dramatically decrease. That's because the taste buds and dopamine response start to reset. The less sugar you eat, the less sugar you want. And suddenly, foods that once tasted normal, right, to you, now start to taste way too sweet. And this is really big. This is a fun thing to be able to kind of journal about as well. Maybe rating things from like a level 1 to a 5 as far as in terms of sweetness. And just as you start to cut down sugar, rating some of the foods that you regularly eat and just see how the sweetness, your perception of the sweetness changes over time. And of course, this is going to be a mindset shift. We don't need to be perfect. This is all about building awareness. Just like we can recognize the impact of alcohol and make intentional choices, we need to do the same with sugar. There's no need to eliminate either one completely. The goal is to just be in control rather than letting these things take control of us. And so at the end of the day, knowledge is power. Once you start recognizing how this affects your body, you can have the freedom to start making better choices without feeling deprived. All right, so how do we move forward? Well, simple, right? Know your risks, make informed choices, both with sugar and alcohol. These are going to impact your health more than you may think. And so you want to consider your risk, your personal risk factors, right? Genetic predispositions, stress level, all of those things that are going to increase your risk of drinking alcohol or eating high amounts of sugar. You want to consider, again, your risk factors. So this, again, it involves knowing your genetic predisposition, understanding, how dependent you may be on these, right? If you realize like, wow, I really need a glass of wine, or I really need that, that piece of cake. If you start to feel like, oh, I really need this, what is it compensating for? Is there a behavior, reward kind of loop going on that you need to be able to disrupt? Sugar, this is a huge one too. Sugary drinks with alcohol. Oof, that's double trouble, right? Cocktails, mixed cocktails, all those wonderfully sweetened things. Well, they're combining both the negative effects of sugar and alcohol, which is going to double overload the liver and increase your risk of, potential problems, health-related problems, even addiction. So you really want to be mindful of the hidden sugars that are in your drinks. And of course, remember, any amount of alcohol is going to affect the brain. If you drink even the set limit in advance, so any level of alcohol is going to affect the brain. So the goal is to always go with a set limit in advance. Just be very mindful of that. And of course, there's lots of tips and tricks in some of the articles for this week to help you with that. But, pacing yourself. I'm only going to have two, tonight. So maybe I start with a glass of water, and then I have, a glass of wine, and then I have another glass of water, and then I have so by the time you do that, then you're spending quite a bit more time socializing. And of course, that's the idea. If you don't need to drink, there's no need to start. If you're somebody who can go out and socialize and you don't feel like, oh, I have to have a wine, and you're doing it more to like be social, opt for that sparkling water with a splash of, something in it, a twist of lemon. You can definitely have fun with some of the mocktails and sparkling waters and things like that without feeling like, you need to start drinking or you need to drink to be, in with the social dynamics. Of course, hydration is key if you are drinking. Not only should you have a set limit in mind and balance that, but make sure you're drinking water, because of course that antidiuretic hormone is going to be letting all of the liquid out of your body, and you're going to be running to the bathroom, dehydrating yourself. So hydration is key. Alternate every other drink with a glass of water to slow your consumption and reduce its effect. Same goes for sugar, right? Reducing the intake is going to help reset the cravings. And of course, you want to stay present. Remember, if you're out, enjoy the company of others, right? It's not just about drinking. Really start to shift your mindset around this, choosing connection over consumption. All right. So to recap quickly, again, remember, alcohol hits your brain in 5 minutes. It affects the neurotransmitters and the critical brain regions like the amygdala, the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the medulla. Like, all of the areas are impacted. Sugar impacts the brain too, though. It hijacks dopamine pathways and it reinforces cravings and addiction, just like alcohol. There is no safe amount of alcohol. That's what we know according to the World Health Organization, and safe as in something that's not going to impact your body. So there is no safe limit where it's not going to impact something. So of course, you're making those decisions based on your health and wellness goals. And of course, sugar acts like alcohol as a chronic toxin. Excess sugar is going to be processed just like alcohol, which of course leads to that fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, metabolic disorders, in the same way that too much alcohol does. And of course, the National Cancer Institute has labeled alcohol as a class 1 carcinogen. Increased alcohol use is going to increase cancer risk. And of course, sugar as well, as far as fueling excessive risk. ultimately the takeaway here is that both of these are going to impact your body, probably more than you may have been aware of. And so that awareness is key. You just really want to think about, do the benefits outweigh the risks for you? All right, so that was a lot. I hope you found that informative. I hope you found that empowering. The idea isn't here, my idea isn't to, demonize either one of these. Certainly, there is going to be a time and place, where we are going to be enjoying a piece of cake or a cookie or a chocolate or whatever it is. But just knowing how it impacts your body, knowing how to be able to balance that, right? If you have that glass of wine, making sure that you're setting limits and you're trying to hydrate and things like that. So all of this is all about knowledge as power. If you do have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You're more than welcome to drop it in the group chat or message me privately one-on-one within the platform.